Investors are gearing up for a busy week of earnings. A slew of airline, defense names, and consumer goods companies are set to report quarterly results for the third quarter over the next several days. The first of the Mag 7 companies, Tesla, they are set to report on Thursday after the market closes. Here to discuss what to watch, we want to bring in Chris Versace, Tematica Research Chief Investment Officer. Chris, it's great to have you back here on Yahoo Finance. Let's talk about the most important thing to watch here in this week ahead. Obviously, Tesla garnering a lot of attention, but what's top of mind for you?
I think it's going to be the aggregate earnings that we see for the S&P 500. And I say that because, we've had a very strong start to October, building on September's gains. But at the same time, the S&P 500's multiple from a PE perspective is extremely stretched compared to historical standards. And I think that really reflects the negative revisions we've seen in second half earnings for that big basket that everybody watches. So to the extent that earnings are coming in better than expected, that could help fuel some further upside in the market. And I think that's what folks really want to pay attention to. And remember underneath, back in early July, early August, GDP expectations were, 2%. But as of last week, the Atlanta Fed GDP Now model, 3.4%. The economy is stronger. There is reason to think earnings could surprise to the upside.
So given that backdrop, Chris, what is your top pick of the Mag 7 names heading into this earnings cycle?
Oh, boy. Great question. I can tell you this. It's not Tesla. I would have to say that most likely it's going to be Nvidia, not exactly an original note. But when we come off a lot of the comments that we've been getting the last few weeks from Nvidia itself, but also from Hon Hai, one of Apple's key manufacturing partners, and then last week's blowout results from Taiwan Semiconductor and their robust guidance for the last quarter of the year, it's got to be Nvidia.
So, Chris, I guess given that, and you mentioned this in your notes, the bifurcation in chip performance, right? So what do investors need to know? Why is Nvidia set up potentially to do just fine, while other names maybe investors should be a bit more wary of?
Yeah, so when we got that question from folks, it was really what's going on in semi-cap land, right? With given what ASML had to say last week versus the capital spending increase that we're seeing at Taiwan Semiconductor, and it really boils down to understanding the companies that you own, who their customers are, who their competitors are, and when you do that, you realize that like Applied Materials, its top two customers, Samsung and Taiwan Semiconductor, whereas at ASML, 80% of their revenue is from not only TSM and Samsung, but also Intel. And we know Intel is having a lot of, serious issues these days. Whether or not they're around as a standalone company, we will see. But one way or another, we know they're rationalizing their capital spending. And I think that really hit ASML's guidance. So again, you need to know what do you own and how is it positioned.
Given the bifurcation that we are seeing in a lot of these chips names, Chris, what is the single biggest differentiating factor that's going to define who gets lumped in with the winners and the losers of the chips names this earnings cycle?
I think right now it's going to be its exposure to AI and data center. So obviously companies like Nvidia, which I just mentioned, but you can also look favorably upon, Marvell. We also own that in the Street Pro portfolio, as well as Nvidia. Some questions around AMD, but there's also some sleepers out there with the stronger than expected performance we're seeing out of the smartphone market and the AI adoption in PC land as well. You might want to take a look at Qualcomm there.
Chris, real quick, let's talk about this move higher that we've seen in the dollar, because that might be something that is mentioned on these earnings calls over the next several days, just how big of a headwind this could be if we do see a bit more room to run within this rally. How big of a headwind or how big of a challenge? How closely are you watching that theme?
Well, I have to watch it, especially if you have multinational companies. To the extent you have companies that are largely domiciled in the U.S. and their businesses almost entirely in the U.S., it's not as big of a deal for the most part. To me, the cue to watch on all of this is going to be, what the Fed speakers have to say this week. We have at least 6 coming, but also what does the Fed Beige Book have to tell us, and what does the flash October PMI from S&P Global later this week say? All that's going to tie into rate cut expectations. And here's the thing, the CME Fed Watch tool shows 350 to 375 in the Fed funds rate by June. We're at 475 to 500. So the market's pricing in a lot of cuts. So we're going to have to really watch that rate cut cadence and the impact on the dollar.
We certainly are going to have to watch the macro. In terms of a little bit more of the micro, Chris, I want to jump back to something that you said about AI and data center spending. You mentioned it's going to be good news for Nvidia. Who are the potential players out there who could potentially get downside pressure off of that same thing? Where could we see some weakness off of that?
Yeah, I think the biggest category that you're going to have to watch is going to be who's getting their lunch eaten, right? If you want to think of it that way. And, the top of my name to that is just simply going to be Intel. Again, it's got its woes. And when we look at all the other commentary, it just continues to support those, those three names that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So Nvidia, Marvell, to some extent, AMD.
Any concerns about Meta, Google, Amazon, Chris, real quickly?
Yes. So I think they'll all perform well. The key here is going to be their capital spending. If they take it up because the AI arms race continues to accelerate, that could lead to a pullback in the shares, but that could be an opportunity.
Chris, always great to speak with you. Thanks for joining us this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you.